Why did villagers burn a girl's heart and make her brother drink the ashes? Why did 60 nobles drown together in a castle latrine? And why was the heart of a French king ground into red paint for a painting? These aren't myths, they're history. And they're only 3 of the 20 disturbing stories I've uncovered. So, welcome to the rabbit hole of disturbing histories. Everyone knows Salem's witches. Fewer know that New England also had its vampires. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis, then called consumption, swept through rural New England. Victims wasted away, pale, thin, coughing blood. To frightened townsfolk it looked as though something was draining their life, and in Rhode Island many believed that meant vampires. The Brown family of Exeter was hit hardest. First the mother Mary died, then the eldest daughter, then 19-year-old Mercy Brown. Soon after, the son, Edwin, also fell sick. Neighbors whispered that one of the dead was feeding on the living. In March 1892, they dug up the family graves. Mary and her eldest daughter were skeletons. But Mercy, buried only 2 months earlier in the frozen ground, still looked strangely intact. Even her heart contained liquid blood. To the villagers this was proof. Mercy was the vampire. They cut out her heart and liver, burned them to ash, and mixed the ashes into a drink given to Edwin as a cure. He died soon after. Mercy Brown's grave is still there in Exeter. People still visit it, not for medicine but for the story. How far would you go to show your love? We are in 14th century Portugal. There is a wedding taking place. Prince Pedro was bound to a political marriage with Constance of Castile. But at the wedding, his gaze fixed on someone else. A quiet lady-in-waiting named Inez de Castro. Their forbidden love became the scandal of Lisbon. The corridors whispered that her powerful Castilian relatives could one day claim the Portuguese throne, and King Afonso IV watched his son with growing suspicion. But something happened that changed fate. Constance died in childbirth. Pedro brought Inez to court and openly defied his father, until the king's patience snapped. In January 1355, while Pedro was away hunting, 3 royal assassins entered the gardens of Coimbra. They cornered Inez near a fountain and decapitated her on the spot. Pedro's grief turned to fury. After ascending the throne, he captured 2 of the killers and had their hearts ripped from their chests in a public spectacle of vengeance. Then came his final act. He exhumed Inez, dressed her in royal robes, and crowned her queen. At a candlelit ceremony, the court was forced to kneel and kiss her decomposing hand. A silent hall filled with perfume, wax, and the presence of death. This is the story of the posthumous Queen of Portugal. Before being the emperor, he was an unknown hostage. In 75 BCE, a young Julius Caesar was sailing the Aegean Sea when his ship was seized by Cilician pirates. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed in their faces and told them to ask for 50. While waiting for the money to arrive, he lived among his captors like he owned the place. He joined their games, recited his own poems to them, and mocked them when they didn't applaud. He even warned them with a smile that once he was free, he would return to crucify them. The pirates laughed. The ransom came and Caesar was released. He immediately raised a small fleet, hunted down the pirates, and captured them without mercy. True to his word, he had them all crucified along the coast. But he added a touch of Roman mercy. Before the crosses were raised, he ordered their throats slit, so that the men who had laughed with him would die quickly, leaving their corpses swaying as a warning on the empty shore. Some coincidences feel like they were written in advance. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. In the story, a shipwreck leaves 4 sailors stranded at sea. Starving and delirious, they draw lots to decide who will be killed and eaten. The victim is a young cabin boy, named Richard Parker. 46 years later, life imitated fiction. In 1884, the yacht Mignonette was crossing the Atlantic when a storm sank the vessel. 4 men escaped in a lifeboat with almost no supplies. Days passed. Hunger and thirst turned to desperation. Eventually the 3 older sailors killed the youngest among them, the cabin boy. His name was also Richard Parker. When they were rescued, the survivors were put on trial in a case that shocked the Victorian world, establishing the legal precedent that necessity was no defense for murder. Edgar Allan Poe had unknowingly written the fate of a real boy decades before it happened, down to his name, his role, and the way he died on an empty sea. The sinking was only the beginning. July 30, 1945. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was heading home after a secret mission, delivering parts for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. In the middle of the Pacific, a Japanese submarine fired 2 torpedoes. The blast tore the ship apart. 12 minutes later, it was gone. Around 900 men made it into the water. No lifeboats, few life vests, almost no food or water, and no one knew they were missing. The first night was chaos. Oil in the water, cries in the dark, men clinging to debris. By the second day, the sun burned their skin raw. Then the shadows appeared. Sharks. At first they circled, then they struck. Fast, violent, dragging men under in seconds. Survivors tried to stay in groups, kicking at the shapes below, but the attacks came day and night. By the time a rescue plane spotted them, only 316 were still alive. It remains the deadliest shark attack in history, 4 days where the ocean itself became the executioner. In 1346, war carried a new kind of weapon, disease. The Crimean port city of KEhoe was under siege by the Mongol army. For months, their catapults hurled stones and burning pitch at the walls. Then something worse. The Mongol camp was hit by the Black Death. Soldiers began dying in droves. Fever, blackened skin, choking coughs. The bodies piled up. And the Mongol commanders had an idea. They loaded the rotting corpses into their siege engines and launched them over the walls. The air in KEhoe filled with the stench of decay. People began to sicken. The plague spread from house to house. Some historians believe this act helped carry the Black Death into Europe. As Genoese traders fled the city by ship, they unknowingly carried the infection with them. Within years it would kill tens of millions. The siege of KEhoe was lifted, but not because the defenders won. By then, both armies were broken, not by swords or arrows, but by a sickness that had no mercy and no cure. In 1918, one man may have spared the life that would change the century. Henry Tandey was a British soldier in the final weeks of World War I, fighting in northern France. He was already one of the most decorated privates in the army, wounded twice, awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery. During the Battle of Marcoing, Tandey's unit pushed the Germans into retreat. Through the smoke, he saw a wounded enemy soldier stumble into view. The man didn't raise his rifle, he just stood there, exhausted and bleeding. Tandey aimed, and then lowered his gun. He let the man walk away. Years later, in 1938, Tandey was shocked to see a photograph of himself displayed in Hitler's mountain retreat. Hitler reportedly told British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that he was the soldier Tandey had spared that day. Historians still debate if the story is true, but the idea lingers, that in a moment of mercy on a French battlefield, Henry Tandey might have let the future dictator of Nazi Germany live. In 1927, the deadliest school massacre in American history wasn't a shooting, it was an explosion. The man behind it was Andrew KEhoe, a 55-year-old school board treasurer. He was bitter over rising taxes, furious after losing an election for township clerk, and facing foreclosure on his farm. Locals later said he began planning his revenge right after that defeat. Known for being difficult and argumentative, KEhoe spent the next year quietly buying explosives and hiding them on his property and beneath the school itself. On May 18, 1927, just after classes began, the dynamite and pyrrhotol he had planted under the north wing detonated. The explosion ripped the building apart, trapping children in the rubble. Neighbors rushed in, pulling survivors out with their bare hands. Then KEhoe arrived in his truck, packed with more explosives. He smiled at rescuers, then detonated it, killing himself and dozens more. In total, 45 people were dead, most of them children. Nearly a century later, the Bath school disaster still stands as the deadliest school attack in U.S. history, planned not in rage, but in cold, methodical silence. Before the French Revolution, terror came from the countryside. 1764. In Gévaudan, a poor rural region in southern France, something began killing. Wolf-like, but larger. Reddish fur. A powerful jaw that went for the throat. Shepherds, women, children, dragged from fields and roads in daylight. Dozens of dead. Panic spread from village to village. The crown stepped in. Royal hunters scoured the forests. In 1765, the king's marksman Antoine de Beauterne killed a huge wolf. It was stuffed and shown at court, proof the beast was dead. But the bodies kept appearing. The victory was a showpiece. The fear did not stop. So came the second hunt, local nobles, peasants, and veteran trackers working the woods for months. In June 1767, a seasoned hunter named Jean Chastel brought down a massive wolf-like animal. Legend says he used a blessed bullet and a prayer. What's certain is this: after that shot, the killings ended. More than 100 victims later, the Beast of Gévaudan was over, and a memory remained of a monarchy that could not keep its people safe, a crack in confidence that some say foreshadowed 1789. Let me know in the comments if you may be interested in a full-length deep dive on the case of the Beast, both hunts, the politics, and the myths. Before we continue, if you're interested in dark, forgotten history, make sure to subscribe. I post every week, big deep dives on one story, and collections of 20 disturbing facts from the past. In 1565, Malta became the focal point of brutal warfare, where the dead were used as weapons. The Ottoman Empire laid siege to Malta, aiming to erase the Knights Hospitaller and break Europe's line of defense. Over months of bombardment, the fiercest fighting raged at Fort St. Elmo. When it finally fell, the Turks captured over 1,500 defenders. Nearly all of them were butchered. Mustafa Pasha ordered a spectacle. The bodies were decapitated, their corpses nailed to crosses, mocking crucifixes, and set adrift across the Grand Harbor toward Fort St. Angelo. The sight of headless knights bobbing in the water was meant to break the defenders' will, but Grandmaster Jean Parisot de Valette answered in kind. He executed his Turkish prisoners, beheading them, and filled his cannons with their heads, firing them toward the Ottoman camp. The message was clear: there would be no mercy on either side. This defiance fueled Maltese resistance. After nearly 4 months of unimaginable cruelty, the relief force finally arrived, and the siege collapsed. Malta stood, and the knights held a bloody line that helped define European history. Some killers look like monsters. Albert Fish looked like nobody at all. Born in 1870, he grew up in an orphanage where beatings were constant. It was there he began to confuse pain with pleasure. By adulthood, he was already spiraling into practices too grotesque to imagine, flagellating himself, driving needles into his flesh, and later, turning that cruelty on children. In New York, Fish lured young boys and girls with promises of work or sweets. He tortured them with what he called his instruments of hell, paddles studded with nails, knives, even cleavers. Then he killed them. Often he ate them. He was a father of 6, hiding in plain sight, traveling across states to target vulnerable children. Authorities believe he murdered 3. Fish himself claimed more than 100. His final victim was 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928. Fish lured her from her family, killed her, and years later sent her mother a letter calmly describing how he had strangled, dismembered, and eaten the child. Albert Fish, known as the Brooklyn Vampire and the Gray Man, was executed at Sing Sing in 1936. He went to the chair smiling. The expression "saved by the bell" sounds lighthearted, but its roots may lie in a very real fear of being buried alive. In past centuries, a medical condition called catalepsy caused sudden rigidity and unresponsiveness. Today we know it's linked to catatonia. Back then, it was often mistaken for death. People were pronounced dead too quickly, and buried while still alive. The horror was real enough to inspire Edgar Allan Poe, but it also drove bizarre medical solutions. In some cases, families placed the body in waiting mortuaries, hospitals for the dead, where the supposedly lifeless were kept for days surrounded by food, wine, and cigars in case they woke up. Others tested for death with brutal methods, chopping off fingers or blowing tobacco smoke into the rectum. None of it worked. Cataleptic patients felt no pain. So coffin makers stepped in. They designed safety coffins with air tubes, glass panels, even poison for those who woke up underground. The most famous design added a bell and cord. If the buried dead awoke, they could ring for help. Whether anyone was truly saved this way is still debated. But the idea that a bell might be the only thing between life and suffocation is chilling enough. In the 1960s, prisoners in Arkansas feared one thing above all: the Tucker telephone. At first glance, it looked like an old crank telephone. But with a few modifications, it became one of the most infamous torture devices in American prison history. Created by prison doctor A.E. Rollins and Superintendent Jim Bruton at the Tucker State Prison Farm, the device delivered electric shocks directly to an inmate's body. The ground wire was tied to the big toe, the hot wire to the genitals. Prisoners were strapped down on a table in the so-called hospital room. Then the crank was turned. Electricity surged through them in violent bursts. Guards called the longer sessions long-distance calls. The Tucker prison farm was already notorious for brutality: whippings, beatings with 5-foot paddles, needles shoved under fingernails, and executions in its electric chair, known as Old Sparky. But the Tucker telephone stood out because of its mix of sadism and mockery, turning torture into a sick joke. The device became so infamous it was later depicted in films like Brubaker. For the men who endured it, the memory was far from cinema. It was pure, state-sanctioned pain. In 1998, a simple mistake left 2 divers stranded in the middle of the ocean, and they were never seen again. Tom and Eileen Lonergan were a young married couple from the U.S., returning from Peace Corps service in Fiji. Before heading home, they stopped in Australia for one last adventure: diving the Great Barrier Reef. On January 25th, they joined a group trip to St. Crispin's Reef, 25 miles off the Queensland coast. The group of 26 plunged into the turquoise water. Hours later, only 24 came back. The Lonergans had been left behind. When they surfaced, there was no boat, no land, just open water stretching to every horizon. For 2 days, no one noticed. Their belongings sat untouched on the boat. Only later did searchers find some of their gear washed ashore, along with a diving slate carrying a desperate message: "We have been abandoned. Please rescue us before we die." The couple's bodies were never recovered. Most believe they succumbed to dehydration, drowning, or were taken by sharks. Their fate remains one of the ocean's cruelest mysteries, later immortalized in the film Open Water. In colonial New England, justice could turn grotesque in the name of religion and superstition. In 1642, the New Haven colony was rocked by one of the most bizarre criminal cases in early American history. A sow gave birth to a deformed piglet, one-eyed and human-like. Authorities declared it divine evidence of bestiality. The pig's father must be a man in sin. That man was George Spencer. Despite no physical evidence and biology proving a human could not impregnate a pig, Spencer was coerced into confessing and hanged. He was decades later pardoned posthumously, deemed an innocent victim of fear and false justice. Then, 5 years later, Thomas Hogg, another servant with a tarnished reputation, was accused under eerily similar circumstances. A sow birthed piglets that allegedly resembled him. One had fair skin and a head like a child's. Prosecutors even dragged him to the barn to scratch the sow, searching for signs of lust. He denied all wrongdoing. Without a confession, the court couldn't fully convict and instead sentenced him for theft and indecent exposure, sparing him execution. These medieval-seeming trials show how colonial legal systems could weaponize superstition, and how one freak birth in a pigsty could condemn a man to death. In 1184, a royal meeting in Germany ended in one of the strangest disasters of the Middle Ages. King Henry VI called his nobles to the city of Erfurt to settle a land dispute. More than 100 lords, bishops, and knights crowded into the upper floor of a large wooden hall. But the old floor couldn't handle the weight. It suddenly collapsed. Everyone fell straight through the rotten boards and into the room below, then further down into the castle's latrine pit. This was no clean water well, it was the building's toilet filled with human waste. About 60 men died that day, some crushed by the fall, others trapped and drowning in the filth. The smell alone may have killed more. King Henry survived by clinging to a window until rescuers pulled him out. Many of his nobles weren't so lucky. The Erfurt latrine disaster became infamous in Europe, a reminder that even the most powerful men could end up powerless, falling into the waste beneath their feet. In 1393 Paris, a royal party ended in horror and nearly killed the king himself. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria threw a masked ball at the Hotel Saint-Paul to celebrate her lady-in-waiting's third marriage. As entertainment, King Charles VI and 4 nobles dressed up as wild men, wearing shaggy costumes made from flax soaked in wax and resin. Some were chained together. They danced in the dim hall before an unaware crowd. Rules were strict. No one could carry a torch inside to keep the costumes from catching fire. But late at night, Charles's brother, the Duke of Orleans, stumbled in drunk, with a lit torch. A spark landed on one dancer's costume, and panic erupted when flames spread fast. King Charles was saved by his 15-year-old aunt, the Duchess of Berry, who threw her skirt over him and smothered the fire. Of the 5 dancers, 4 burned to death or died from their wounds. Only the king and 1 other escaped. The accident shocked Parisians. It proved that the court had become reckless and decadent, and shook the king's reputation so badly that the rulers had to publicly beg forgiveness. In Maori culture, a preserved head was once a sacred treasure. Known as 𝐬𝐽𝐫𝐞𝐿, these were the tattooed heads of chiefs or loved ones, carefully preserved after death so their 𝐬𝐽𝐽, the face tattoos carrying family history and status, would never be lost. For the Maori, it was a way of honoring memory and ancestry. But in the early 1800s, when European traders arrived in New Zealand, everything changed. British collectors became obsessed with these preserved heads. They offered guns and supplies in exchange. Muskets especially were powerful during the tribal wars of that time. At first, the Maori traded genuine 𝐬𝐽𝐽, but as demand grew, the trade turned dark. Prisoners and slaves were forcibly tattooed with crude imitations of 𝐬𝐽. Then they were killed, their heads preserved and sold to European buyers. What began as a spiritual practice was twisted into a market of death. By the mid-1800s, the trade had become so disturbing that the New Zealand government banned it. But the damage was already done, ancestral treasures scattered across Europe, and countless lives lost to greed. In the early 19th century, French painters were known to use a pigment called mummy brown. It was made by grinding up human remains, sometimes even royal ones. One of the most striking examples was confirmed by forensic historian Philippe Charlier. He analyzed a painting called Vue de Caen by Alexandre Poe de Saint-Martin, kept in the Tandey Museum in Pontoise. Under the microscope, proteomics, and CT scans, he identified human heart tissue, compatible with Louis XIV himself. Calcifications and signs of gangrene matched the medical descriptions of the Sun King's death in 1715. Another painting, Interior of a Kitchen by Martin Drolling at the Louvre, has long been rumored to contain royal mummy brown. Though scientific confirmation is still pending, the story has persisted for 2 centuries. What began as embalmed relics of kings ended mixed into paint, brushed onto canvas, and left hanging silently on museum walls. Few images of Viking cruelty are as haunting as the blood eagle. According to medieval sagas, it was a ritual execution reserved for the worst enemies. The victims' ribs were cut open from the back, pried outward, and their lungs pulled through the wounds to look like wings. Salt might be rubbed into the wounds. Whether it was real or part of legend, it was meant as the ultimate message of terror. The 𝐼𝐻𝐽𝐫 saga and 𝐻EIMskringla describe it in detail. One famous case was King 𝐸𝐿a of Northumbria. In 867 he was captured by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking killed in a pit of snakes. To avenge their father, they carved the blood eagle into 𝐸𝐿a's back. Another victim may have been Halfdan, a rival king in Norway, though sources conflict. Historians still debate if the ritual was ever actually performed or if Christian monks exaggerated Viking brutality, but in the sagas, the blood eagle stood for absolute vengeance, a punishment so grotesque even enemies whispered it in fear. In 1849, Parisians whispered of a vampire haunting the cemeteries. For months, graves at Montparnasse and Père-Lachaise were found disturbed, coffins pried open, bodies dragged out, the dead, mostly women, mutilated in ways too grotesque to describe. Rumors spread of a predator feeding on corpses. Police and gravediggers set a trap. A coffin was prepared with a freshly buried body, and inside it, a hidden firearm rigged to fire. Then they waited. One night the intruder returned. He broke open the coffin, leaned inside, and the gun discharged. The man staggered away, wounded. Days later, a French army sergeant named François Bertrand turned up in a military hospital with unexplained injuries. Investigators connected him to the desecrations. Bertrand confessed in chilling detail. He had spent months digging up the dead, dismembering them, and committing other things. At his tribunal, doctors struggled to even classify his impulses, eventually describing them as a new pathology, being attracted to dead. Sentenced to prison, Bertrand became known as the Vampire of Montparnasse, a soldier by day and by night, a predator of the grave. That's the end of today's video. So, which one of these facts you liked the most? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. I make these videos alone, and even though this is a voiceover, the research and writing take a huge amount of time. Your support is what makes it possible for me to keep digging up these stories.